Ilan, to what degree is Abbas a credible address, both for combating incitement, but also for engagement? I mean, to the degree that David described him as being an important address for the Israeli security establishment.
Sure. Thanks, Ron, and thanks everybody for being here, for having me here. And it's just such an honor to be here with David and Laura. What a great combination, and some other former colleagues who are also part of the team who I see in the audience. So, I would say on this, and I very much agree with where David started, Abbas has a role to play in setting the environment. So does Netanyahu, so does the United States. But ultimately, most of the violence and what's going on now is outside of his control, particularly since the source of so much of this is East Jerusalem, which he doesn't really control. That's not where Palestinian security forces are. I would say what we should try to do, and where the U.S. should take this next, and you saw this foreshadowing with this meeting tomorrow and a briefing late last week from some White House officials and Dan Shapiro. For the next at least year and a half, and probably longer, what this is about is preservation of the possibility of the two-state solution. I don't think you really have a credible setup for a real negotiation, and that the problem there is on three sides, I would argue. On the Palestinian side, Abbas, I do believe that despite the rhetoric, his overall commitment, his willingness to work with the security forces, he's somebody who does believe in nonviolence overall. Though you don't excuse some of this public statements and some of the other things of the past few months. Some of it is emotional, some of it is his own domestic politics. You can't excuse it; it's inexcusable. But fundamentally, he is a weak leader. He's not a decisive leader. He's a risk-averse leader. He's never going to be the man who cuts the deal. And then you have Netanyahu, who I don't know if he believes in a two-state solution or not. You hear different things publicly. I think you got to take him at his word at the end of the day that he does. But given the coalition that he has, I don't think that he can really negotiate in this context. And on top of that, I'm not sure he's the risk taker that you need to actually. He's not a Rabin or even an Olmert, somebody who is more willing to take risks. That's not Netanyahu's nature. So I have a hard time seeing him being the Israeli leader who's going to cut the agreement. And with President Obama, you have somebody who doesn't really have a lot of leverage, especially with the Israeli public, which is one of the single most important elements of leverage any U.S. president has in these types of negotiations. And this president doesn't have that relationship with the Israeli public. And so we're not going to change that. All I think the U.S. can do, at least for the next year and a half and probably longer, is be in a preservation mode. And there's three things that the United States should be doing. First is tamping down the violence by improving the environment, and I think everything David discussed is absolutely right, and that really trying to get agreements on both Palestinian statements and the types of things, that incitement, and also on access for Palestinians to pray on the Temple Mount and the controversies there, and their Secretary Kerry's intervention a couple of weeks ago seems to have done some good. Still
the cameras, the cameras on the Temple Mount.
But even the cameras, I think, are less important than just quietly taking off restrictions on letting Palestinians of all ages worship there on a Friday, which did happen in the aftermath of those discussions. The cameras and having the 24-hour visuals was the big public statement, but the access, I think, is a lot more important on the Palestinian side. And in exchange, toning down some of the public rhetoric that is so problematic. The other two areas where you want to try to preserve, outside of violence in the near future, one is Palestinian institutions, where if security cooperation falls apart, if the PA falls apart for numerous reasons, if there's an incredibly messy transition process after Abbas, if there's nobody there to rule, you can't have a two-state solution. And so taking steps to strengthen those institutions and find ways to maybe manage the transition from Abbas, which is coming in the next few years. And finally, there is settlements on the Israeli side, and you're not going to stop all construction and all building in this type of environment and with this type of Israeli government, but the U.S. can lay down encouraging markers on the worst kind of settlement activity, the kind of settlement activity that would actually fundamentally change the map and threaten any final agreement. And so deterring and dissuading those types of statements and working with the Europeans on all of those things together is a type of thing I think that the U.S. can be doing, and probably what the president would like to hear from Prime Minister Netanyahu when he's in town late tomorrow.
Laura, you've been steeped both in this kind of thing, but also in the Jewish community, as we all have to a certain degree. What is the U.S. What can the U.S. do in this situation? What can the U.S. Jewish community? What is its role here?
Thank you, Ron. And before I start, since we're back together throwing out ideas for peace, I brought some stress balls. So in the State Department, whenever we had staff meetings, we broke these out because this in chocolate, actually, but we got that afterward.
There's a joke in here about explaining to the Israelis that the Americans really do have balls, but that's another story.
Just to pick up on some of the things that Ilan and David were talking about, as I was listening to Ilan speak about preservation, and also listening to the White House briefing last week, I had this feeling that we were entering a new stage of diplomacy, which I think of as cryo-diplomacy. We're almost trying to freeze things in place, almost medically. You know, you have cryopreservation when a patient is so ill, but you don't want him to die on your watch. So I feel like what we're doing now is trying to keep things in place so they don't get any worse, so that potentially in the next administration, we might be in a place with some real solutions. So again, we're talking about preservation. So what can we do? You listen to what came out of the White House last week and you say, wait a minute, this overturns everything that we ever operated on, right? The assumption always was you need a diplomatic horizon in order for there to be progress. Without the promise of diplomacy and a political solution, that will lead to increased violence. But last week you heard out of the White House a very different message, which was a real shift. And they said, no, actually, we don't really see a final status solution coming out in the next 15 months. So you might think, wow, that's really contradicting what they think. But in fact, it isn't. I think what the White House is saying to Obama is, Abu Mazen stood up at the UN and said, I'm out. Obama is saying, I'm out. And he's now saying to Netanyahu, you own this problem. It's for you to do something about, which is really at the top of every talking point sheet we ever walked into, an interview or a speech. It was always, it's up to them. It's up to the parties. Now it officially has been declared. It is up to you. Now it's just not open-ended where Netanyahu can say, great, it's up to me. I can do whatever I want. There's a very implicit, I don't want to call it a threat, but there are consequences hanging over him. Because at the end of 8 years, there are two options out there, which has always been floating out there as a possibility for what the administration could do, what they really want to do. One of them and both of them have to do with formalizing a Palestinian state, actually putting out there what the administration believes would be a just solution. One of them would be in the form of a UN Security Council resolution, potentially led by France, but quietly backed by the United States. And the other would be putting out some kind of parameters, whether it would be in a speech that Secretary Kerry would deliver or the president himself. And we always talked about all different kinds of options out there, but the idea was the go big speech, that finally they would hand off in the last month or two of the administration, just as President Clinton had with his parameters. So if you think about the irony of how far we've come and yet how little ground we've covered, if that is the case, and assuming or not assuming, but if Secretary Clinton became president, you would have a Clinton parameters from 16 years ago being handed off to the next Clinton. The other thing, where we're kind of standing in I would call it a graveyard of assumptions, right? You assume that what Abu Mazen says has an influence on the Palestinians. But when I talked to Palestinians last week, they said, the only people who listen to Abu Mazen are Bibi Netanyahu and the U.S. Congress. Palestinians aren't listening to Abu Mazen. He has no influence. In fact, this uprising, this violence, has more to do with their unhappiness with him than with the occupation, or at least as much to do. And this is coming from Palestinians on the ground. As you were saying, it's different when you're over there and when you stand here. So that's an assumption that's been overturned. The concept of linkage, which was popular at the beginning of the administration, there was a linkage between the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and all the other regional turmoil. That we've seen pretty much overturned. Diplomatic horizon. The other thing that we talked about all the time with our stress balls was final status. If we were going to make peace, it had to be a comprehensive final status deal. All of a sudden, what we're hearing now is interim. Interim is in. It's the resurgence of confidence building measures, and Netanyahu is bringing, right, to Obama a package of confidence building measures. It's like Christmas in November. He's presenting a package of confidence building measures to the Palestinians, to Obama, and Obama's going to deliver a package of munitions, confidence security building measures to the Israeli government. So we're looking at a period which is completely overturning what a lot of our basic assumptions were. The givens are gone, and we're starting a new path, but there are opportunities.
David, you wanted to add something.
Look, I think sometimes we gotta step back and excuse my metaphors. This will be a sports one, but people know I see a lot of friendly faces. They know I love sports, so I have to do it. Look, the United States has been trying to hit the home run ball now on three major periods. The year 2000, as Laura mentioned, the Clinton period, Camp David. As soon as Clinton left office, they called it Taba for a few days. Then there was a second period of Condoleezza Rice, the Annapolis process, which we had Abbas and Olmert tried to deal with this issue. And then the period that the three of us got to work on with Secretary of Kerry, the Kerry Initiative, if you want to call it that, the framework, 2013 and 2014. So what is the commonality of those three has been that we each time try to hit the home run ball. And obviously when you try to hit the home run ball, there's a higher chance that you could strike out. When you swing for the fences. And look, I think sometimes you have to step back. We just commemorated the horrific 20th anniversary of Rabin. I covered Rabin. I felt close to him. The Hebrew name of my middle name of my oldest son is Yitzchak. He was on the Middle East Mount Rushmore. But when we look back at that period of the 90s, people say, oh, there was Madrid. That was a meeting. Then there was Oslo, the secret talks. I wrote a chance to write a book on that. That was a kind of a framework going forward, but it started modestly. Gaza, Jericho, but what happened is now we have the most risk-averse leaders. We're not in the era of the giants anymore. But the most risk-averse leaders, and Ilan mentioned it as well, are now having to deal with the toughest issues. So if the bar used to be close to the floor in the 90s, the bar is now at the ceiling. So we have the most risk-averse leaders dealing with the toughest issues. After the trust has been shattered, you're putting Humpty Dumpty back together again. It's hard to do. And to me, it's a big analytical struggle for a new administration. I saw Bougie Herzog, the head of the Labor Party, gave a speech, a couple speeches now in the Knesset recently talking about separation, which was Rabin's theme, and I would argue a shorthand for let's just create two separate entities, even if we don't solve all the problems on the front end. So I think the point is we've been front-loading everything in these last three times. I'm not, here to criticize President Clinton or I think, and Secretary Kerry said two sides say they want a two-state solution. Let's get them to a two-state solution. But having tried it three times, it might be, and this is now after the Arab Spring and the meltdown almost of the Arab nation-state system all around these parties, that the most risk-averse leaders are not going to be able to have the bar all the way up here. And then maybe we got to go for some singles and doubles and not try to hit that home run ball, because it isn't for a lack of trying by the United States in those three distinct efforts. I think in the period we were in was probably the greatest investment of the United States ever in terms of final status issues. And people think Kerry was relentless. I could tell you, the three of us could tell you, you don't even know the tip of the iceberg of it. So I don't think it was for lack of trying. If we didn't get it through the front door, the side door, the back door, the window, the basement, the chimney, we tried to go 5 for 5. Jerusalem, the territories, the security arrangements, refugees, the idea of the character of the state, mutual recognition, i.e. Jewish state. We tried to go 5 for 5. I think we had more success than the American Jewish community realized. Maybe I'm being more generous. I think in territories and refugees, without getting into details, more than the American Jewish community would realize. But on those remaining three issues, I don't think we were close. And therefore, I think I want to be caution and say I don't want to set us up for failure. I'm also worried, very bluntly, about a new generation of college students. I go out there. I think I just had my 98th visit to a college campus in the last few years. And what scares me is that, I at least remember the ups and downs. I was fortunate. I was a journalist in the heady days of the 90s to see, the Madrid, the handshake on the White House lawn, the Jordan-Israel peace treaty and the Arava. But if you're 20 years old today, okay, or 21 or 22 or 23, you weren't even born when these things happen often. And the net effect is you were not born even with the Jordan-Israel peace treaty of 94. So in this roller coaster where we've seen ups and downs, The young people have only seen downs. And that to me is very important, because also about the people in the region. It's not about us or college students here, it's about them. But when you don't see any ups, the net effect is there becomes some public disbelief that anything is possible. The Talmud says, tafasta meruba lo tafasta. In other words, don't overreach. But if people could start seeing some successes, we aim a little lower, but we succeed in what we do, I think we'll get more people, adherents, back on the field rooting with us, because they'll think there's some hope. But if we always try to hit the high bar, and no one's been able to hit the high bar, then I worry that that sense of cynicism deepens. And with that cynicism comes greater despair and all the consequences coming from that sense of despair. And that I worry a lot about.
Something that's come up that's interesting is the fact that you've got, like, Clinton in his last few months of his presidency laying down parameters. You had the Annapolis coming in the kind of the tail end, not at the very last months, but the tail end of the Bush administration, and you had Reagan effectively recognizing the PLO in his lame duck period. I mean, and all those things, interestingly, although they came from lame duck presidents, helped shape the way we see the peace process now. Do you think that there's something that the Obama administration can do on its way out that could be even a minor game changer?
Do you want me to? I'll maybe take that, Ron, and also sort of tail it back in with David's comments, because here's the biggest challenge with, and I'll get to your question and sort of marry it with David's, the biggest challenge with the singles and doubles as opposed to the home run, and I would say we're probably like, we're like a 100 power hitter, I mean, Ron Deere maybe. But the problem is at this point, especially for the Palestinians, there's so little confidence there, and they want the end state. Sometimes I've heard this put glibly, Abbas doesn't want negotiations, he just wants an agreement. Netanyahu doesn't want an agreement, he just wants negotiations. This is the cynicism that comes from the Palestinian side. Whenever you try to do confidence building now after 13 or 14 or 15 or 20 years of doing this, and this is the challenge that you face, is all the sides are so negative. So in some ways what you need to do is you do need to hit those singles and doubles. You need to start building a positive story. And even as you're doing it, you need to start setting a vision of what the end state looks like and keep that out there, keep that hope and that diplomatic horizon out there somehow. And this is where you get to, is there anything that the Obama administration can do or that the United States can do generally? First, I don't think a Security Council resolution is really possible, not because even if the president were to support it, I don't think you can actually get it through the Security Council, because the Palestinians, look, the reality is whatever would be done would be rejected by both Palestinians and Israelis, because it would have to be something that would be viewed by the United States as balanced, which means it would have very, very difficult things in there for both sides. If the Palestinians oppose it, they'll probably take it to the Arab states, which I think will be Egypt, will be the new member of the Security Council. They'll take it to the Russians and the Chinese, and I have a hard time believing that they'll vote for it. So even if the U.S. and France and the Europeans all came to an agreement on something, which I think is also really questionable, I just don't think it gets through. So the concern about that I don't think is realistic. Would Obama do a parameter statement as a way of trying to say, here's what an end state looks like? Maybe. And would it have much effect? I don't know how much more of an effect it would have than the Clinton parameters already, unless you were to go much more detailed. The thing I prefer, and I would like to see more of, and something I've spent a little time working on, is trying to actually find a way to get into much greater levels of detail about what the final outcome sort of looks like. What does a two-state solution look like? There's a cliche in the two-state solution world that everybody knows what the solution is, and that the parameters are already out there, and all we have to do is work out the details. The details are everything in this conflict, and nobody understands them. Does the Israeli public actually understand what security arrangements would actually mean in the context of the two-state solution? Unless somebody actually credibly sits down, and an Israeli leader were to sit down in detail and say, I've talked with chief of staff, I've talked with the Ramatkal, I've talked with my folks in the Shin Bet, I've talked with everybody, and we've come up with a plan that the Americans and the Palestinians and everybody has agreed to, and this is what it looks like, and this is how we secure Israel in this context. I don't think anybody actually knows what that looks like. Some people might, and some of us who have worked at this level of detail that David referenced might, but the Israeli public doesn't. Does the Palestinian public understand what a just and agreed solution on the refugees looks like? No. And what they would get from that and what they wouldn't get from that, which is not a lot, millions of Palestinians coming back into Israel, which is probably not something that they necessarily want once you get into like really detailed discussions on it. So I think there's also a space there for a much deeper effort by the United States, by groups outside of the U.S. government, by the Europeans working with the Palestinians, by us working with the Israelis, and by Israeli leaders and Palestinian leaders to try to actually get at the details and explain that, because that's not going to be a parameters statement or a Security Council resolution. That's actually trying to lay it out for people very practically and in a detailed fashion, even as you do the things David talked about, which is trying to at least set a better mood and look for some singles and doubles.
If I could just add 2 seconds, I don't want to monopolize. I just found my takeaway from being in government is each of these leaders, they do want a deal, but they want a deal on their terms. And when they find out that deal on their terms that they had envisioned in their head is not attainable, their view of the United States is we're supposed to arm wrestle the other side to get them that deal on their terms. Because otherwise it looks very much like a vertical leap for them that they're not capable of doing. So it's not like each side doesn't want peace, yes, but each side is deathly afraid of the terms that it would require of them. And therefore, either they don't do it or they want us to arm wrestle the other side to get them what they want, as opposed to, well, we're going to have to compromise. I don't think either of these, again, they compromised, I think, on 2 of the 5, but on the other 3 issues, I did not think we were close. And I'm just worried, because every time we try to do 5 for 5 and fail, I worry if we don't prepare the ground, and maybe, I would hope that what my colleagues are saying here, that it would somehow prepare it better, but I worry that just to say, well, we'll try again, it deepens, a loss of credibility for the United States, and there's violence that can emerge from it too. This is not to excuse the parties, but I'm just saying, it's not that the guys, each side doesn't say they want peace. Of course, everyone wants peace. But the question is the cost. Are they willing to pay that cost? And how they view the United States in that context.
So
Go ahead.
your question is, what is the administration likely to do as they hand off to the next? We're talking about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but of course for this administration, they've already secured their big win in the Middle East, which is the Iran deal. So the president has an accomplishment. I think what's more important for him, rather than, he's already stated that he doesn't expect a final status deal with the Israelis and Palestinians. I think what's very important to him is that the 2-state solution not die on his watch. I think that he believes that because he generally believes that would be just, and also because it's something that he's put a lot of time into. So when we talk about, our philosophy was go big or go home, and so here we are, the 3 of us at home, spending more time with our kids and sitting at think tanks. But just to sort of echo what David was saying, embrace the doable. I think that is going to be likely the philosophy going forward. And I don't think the president is looking for any fights, not with Netanyahu. He won. And not with the American Jewish community. And a lot of these ideas that we've talked about that are possibilities, parameters, a UN Security Council resolution, that's, the mortar of that is blood and crushed bones of, and I'm not sure that the president needs another fight. I think he made his point. That I will do, I am the president here, that, you're not the tail that wags the dog, in fact.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
I just want to completely agree with Laura on that one point, that most likely I see, despite all these discussions, I see nothing coming out in the next year and a half on these fronts, precisely because I don't think the president wants another major political headache or fight.
Well, in terms of appealing to the sides to keep things steady and to prevent things from blowing up, there's been a lot of talk around what's been going on in the Temple Mount or Rama Sharif about turning this from a national conflict into a religious conflict. And I remember covering the second to last major outbreak of violence on the Temple Mount, regarding the Temple Mount, that was in 1991 or 1990, when their riots broke out, and the ostensible instigator was a third Templist named Gershon Salomon, who went with his group up to the Temple Mount. And nobody saw this coming, in part because Gershon Salomon was always trying to get in through the Mughrabi gate and was always pushed back by police, and he did something else. But what was interesting, and although the Palestinian exploitation of this attempt was cynical to a degree, in this particular instance, the day before, in order to appease certain political interests, the police minister, Roni Milo, who eventually became the mayor of Tel Aviv, agreed to a photo op with Gershon Salomon in his office. And I think that picture spoke more than 1,000 words to a lot of Palestinians. I mean, the Israelis were maintaining the status quo according to the letter, but for the first time there appeared to be an accommodation of the Third Templists. And now now it's gotten to the stage where you have a minister in government who goes up to the Temple Mount, prays, and talks about replacing the mosques, even while Netanyahu is doing his best to maintain the technical status quo. I mean, what can the Obama administration justifiably expect from the Netanyahu government in terms of things that play into the perceptions that Palestinian leaders are all too willing to exploit? And what does the American Jewish community have in that role, if anything?
All right. Look, I think that, and Ilan mentioned it, you had a three-way meeting with Kerry, Netanyahu, well, it wasn't three-way all at the same time, but with Kerry, Netanyahu, and King Abdullah of Jordan. And it's interesting that the two achievements that the secretary has had over the last year have both been in terms of with King Abdullah and not with Abbas. He is the custodian of the Temple Mount and agreeing to find ways to tamp it down. And you point out correctly, Ron, that Netanyahu did his part too, which is ease off on the age restrictions. So I think that's important that Netanyahu, in his words, said, Jews aren't there to pray there. And I know some people say, well, why not? But again, at a time where we have so many flammable things, I don't think, Temple Mount first is really the way to lower it. I really worry that it just, like I said, I God forbid World War III, but I think it could be extremely explosive. So I think getting the three leaders to kind of articulate what the status quo is at least the beginning. And even that they didn't fully do. But the prime minister said that they could visit there, but they don't pray there. So I think that was an important step. Sometimes I think some things are like very low tech and simple, and Israel is amazingly adept with this startup nation that if somebody lived in Gaza on a fourth floor walk up, in Jabalia, well, Jabalia is probably not doing fourth floor walk ups, but I mean, they somehow were able to find the guy's smartphone or a regular phone and text him that says, "Hey, get out of here. We're about to text. Go to the beach or go wherever you're going, but don't stay here." So they could find this guy in a corner of Gaza, but it's amazing to me. The same startup nation, and maybe we have people in the audience who are very much into technology, is why can't you use technology instead of warning people not to stay in Gaza before an attack, to convey messages in Arabic to people's smartphones about, Israel and the status quo on the Temple Mount. People say, oh, they won't believe Israelis. Well, maybe they would believe King Abdullah of Jordan. Get those messages to this guy's smartphone in Kalandia or wherever he is in Jabal Mukaber, Tzur Bacher, or Isawiya, or Azariah, or wherever he is in East Jerusalem, and convey those messages. I'm just saying, if Israel could find the people in Gaza, they could find them in East Jerusalem. I'm not trying to trivialize this question, but I think it speaks to a failure of imagination that messages in Arabic are not coming across. And if you say that anything Netanyahu says, the Palestinians will believe the opposite, which is fair enough. But there are other people out there that are saying the same thing. And maybe they say, well, I don't believe what the secretary says. But maybe they believe what the king of Jordan says. So let's be creative and find ways to tamp it down that are not just government to government, but use the technology the way Israel's able to use the technology when it comes to a war. Use it for peace.
Can I just, Ron, one thing on your question on how much do we hold Netanyahu sort of responsible? I mean, he's got to be responsible. It's his coalition. It's his government. Uri Ariel is part of his government. Obviously, Uri Ariel and folks sort of that persuasion are working at a different agenda. And we saw this all the time during the negotiations. Netanyahu would quietly try to tamp down these types of other elements to avoid things that would cause a huge blow-up, like really meaningless settlement announcements coming right at the very end before the negotiations collapsed, but that played a significant role because of the public press they generated. I don't believe was something Netanyahu wanted or something that he controlled. On the other hand, it is his government, and there are times when some of these elements go out and do something publicly, and then Netanyahu, as the prime minister of Israel, needs to very publicly go out and not just very loudly, publicly and clearly say, no, that's not me, that's not my government, that's not our position. And I don't think he always does that. Sometimes he says, well, it's out there, I can't do anything about it politically now, so let me quietly try to work it behind the scenes. I think this comes, after Uri Ariel's visit. I think he did it to the Temple Mount in September. I think there was a lot of quiet work. There was a reiteration of the need to maintain the status quo and his commitment to the status quo, but there was never actually a condemnation or really going and saying, you can't do this publicly. And so I think this is part of the challenge. And as the U.S. government, we can both recognize that this is not something Netanyahu wanted, but at the same time, he chose this coalition. It's his government. We have to hold him accountable as the leader of Israel.
Okay, I'm going to have one last question I'm going to ask for some audience questions. John Kerry has the mentality of the 12-year-old. Benjamin Netanyahu is chicken droppings. What do we do to control the children in our own backyard? Never mind the children in the Middle East. We've got a spokesman, Netanyahu hasn't counted him out yet, that has described John Kerry as mentally deficient and Barack Obama as an anti-Semite. Never mind the provocative things he said about Israeli politicians. And then, of course, we had the chicken dropping episode a year ago.
Well, obviously you're seeing a breakdown in message discipline on all sides. I think that we've seen people, leaders from all three sides, say things that they later tried to, walk back or admitted were inappropriate. I think it's symptomatic, though, of a kind of resentment and tension in the relationship. Very much, between all three sides, but I'm just going to focus on the Israeli-American side. A lot of days we spent bickering with the Israelis over what they were saying about us or what we were doing with them. And I think that it's part of a larger phenomenon. It ties into the Jewish community. As Jews acquired more power, more political power, it became almost like a housing bubble or a real estate bubble. There's almost been a Jewish bubble and I think that we've seen it pop over the summer. I think the Iran deal actually was the moment where a U.S. administration, where I really saw a turn actually was the Gaza war last summer, where the administration felt like they were really humiliated and undercut by Israeli actions during the war without getting into all the details. And you heard people saying out loud, quite loudly sometimes in the stairwell of the State Department, we are the United States of America. We will not be ruled by, whether it's domestic constituencies or Israelis. We are the United States. And so I think part of this is people are just getting emotional over it. And like I said, it's more about bickering than brokering. Hopefully now it's the morning after a bad brawl, and tomorrow there'll be a meeting and we can all get to a more civil place. But I do think it's symptomatic of a kind of, in Hebrew they say, Yotze lo mipo. It was just all the way up to here. And, Obama himself was saying things to his advisors like, well, maybe I would accept this, but I don't want to be a friar. When you have Obama going Middle East like that, worrying that he's going to be a sucker with Netanyahu, you know that you've reached...
I didn't know Obama knew the term friar. That's good.
That's one of the best kept secrets.
Well, there we go.
This is the scoop. You heard it here.
Right. Obama didn't want to be a friar, and
that's interesting. Steve, I think we have until 5:15. Is that correct? Or okay. So I would like to hear from the audience. I see. Okay, good. Go ahead. Okay, that question was from Brooke from J Street U in North Carolina, and her question was she's from J Street U and she wants to know how we collectively as a Jewish community can take responsibility for preserving the two-state solution.
I would try. Look, I thank you, Brooke, for your question, and it's when I hear people like you and as I see them across the country, it keeps me going. Because I know there are people out there who care. My basic view is the campus ecosystem is kind of different maybe than other parts. first rule would be is to try to avoid doing things that rip people apart. Things like BDS and things like that, I think are not based on the idea of how do you build the two-state solution. If it was, people might look at it a little differently, but they don't hear that. They said let all the refugees return, let's sanction Israel. They don't even hear the words, they don't hear it as a Palestinian J Street or anything like that. So we need to identify allies, it seems to me, when I say we, as people who care about the two-state, whether you're Jewish, not Jewish, and whether they're in minority groups, black students, Hispanic students, LGBT. It seems to be the minorities are very susceptible to the message of SJP, of the Students for Justice in Palestine, which don't focus on two states, but just focus on, occupation. And it seems to me that there's got to be more outreach to these minority students because they're saying, hey, you have a wall, we have a wall. They'll say to Hispanic students or something like that. And there'll be other ways. Oh, it's about power and privilege. It's like we're underprivileged, you're underprivileged. And it's not even about Israelis and Palestinians. It becomes about American Jewish students. I mean, let's keep the focus on them. And let's see if we could create coalitions on campuses around this idea. Now, what's a little hard maybe for parts of the American Jewish community, although not all of the parts of the American Jewish community, is coalitions are two-way streets. That's what a coalition is. You can't just say, support my position against BDS, but I'm not going to help you on something you care about. Maybe it's about minimum wage for university clerical workers. I don't know. Every campus is different about the terms, but I would try to think out of the box in these places and find ways to create coalitions. We're not going to have maybe a Gentile birthright program that's going to bring everybody on every college campus to Israel, but maybe there's got to be a need to identify who are the minorities and other leaders, not only minorities, but to let them see the complexities and let them see the warts too. And make sure they go to Ramallah, make sure they go to the West Bank. And let them just see this is not a cardboard cutout. This is not a morality play of a soap opera. These are tough, tough issues, as each of us can attest to, having to try to grapple with them. I think that's the best way to deal with BDS and things like that. We got to get out there, we got to get the message out, and we got to bring people over there who can see the complexity. They won't accept the Jewish narrative necessarily as sacrosanct. It doesn't matter. All they got to see is that these are tough issues. And if Israelis and Palestinians could work them through, could sit together at least, try, governments of Israel, governments of Palestinians at least were sitting together, at least till recently. What drives me nuts is to see SJP students, Students for Justice in Palestine students, say, an American student saying, I'm not going to sit with that Jewish student because that's normalization. That's something I would hear in Gaza. We shouldn't, my last sentence would be, let's not import the politics of confrontation of the Mideast. Let us export the politics of pluralism, tolerance, and dialogue that are hallmarks of American society.
Laura, you wanted also to?
No, well put.
Anybody? Yes, this is you. Yeah. That's Jonathan from Northwestern, and his question was: are we getting to the point where Palestinians would prefer a one-state reality and to live in a single state as equal citizens?
I'll jump in on that one. So one of the things that I did while I was on the peace team was I would travel over to Israel and the West Bank about every 6 weeks and speak to Israelis and Palestinians, from cabinet members, but also kids. I mean, all elements of society, to see what the public support was for a peace deal. And, we would start off, I would say to them, we're here to help you solve the problem with a two-state solution. And what I found with Israelis is they'd look at me and say, problem? What problem? We don't have a problem. Life is good right now. And that was frustrating. But what was frightening for me was that the reaction from Palestinians, which was, two-state solution? What two-state solution? We've moved beyond that now. Time is on our side, and we're looking for a one-state solution. So this was even in the heat of our negotiations, when we were building public support for what we thought would be a referendum to vote on our final status deal that we had helped broker. So this is something that's been a long time coming, and I think that it's, there's a relationship between that, and I'm sure that if you graphed it, it would be the further you moved away from Oslo, the higher the support was. Part of it is perception also. Dennis Ross, I think he's speaking next. I'll let him talk about the main thesis of his book, but one thing he says that the Obama administration, the reason why they're making demands on Netanyahu and the Israelis is that the Israelis are the stronger party. They're clearly the stronger party, and the Palestinians are the weaker. But what's completely mixed up in the Middle East, and all of you know because you immerse yourselves in these issues, is the apparently strong, what appears to be strong, the Israelis, the Jews, see themselves, if they look back in history, and even if they look forward, right, as weak. So the appearances and the realities are there's a disconnect. And the same thing for the Palestinians. They seem like the weaker party, but if they look back to their history from 100 years ago, right, they were part of an empire, a glorious empire. And if they look to the future, they see that again. So it's very complicated psychologically. I think sometimes we don't always get these nuances right. And I think that's one of the reasons why they're supporting one-state solution, because although they are apparently the weaker party, they see strength over time.
Yes, go ahead. Allison from New York asking how rhetoric coming from Iran about Israel disappearing, combined with the proliferation of social media, combined with the unrest of the Arab Spring, what does that mean for the prospect of a two-state solution, or even for the existence of Israel?
Thank you. Well, starting with the sort of Iran angle, as somebody who spent a few years working on Iran issues in the U.S. government, and then a few years on Israeli-Palestinian issues, I was amazed at how little those two actually interacted. And I think that that's actually true, and I think everybody prefers to keep it that way. There's always these talks about linkages, but I'm not sure that they're as strong as people believe that they actually are. The Iran issue is obviously, especially the rhetoric that comes out of Tehran, is obviously unacceptable and something you need to be very worried about. When you look at Iranian actions, I think that sometimes they talk a big game and they try to live by it, but they also tend to not be able to execute as much as they threaten. And so, to me, the bigger challenge actually comes from, and David referenced this earlier, the implosion of so many of the Arab republics in and around Israel. Syria, Iraq, even Egypt, which has not gone through the same type of implosion, is a lot weaker internally than what it was. And that, I think, really rocks Israeli confidence to the core of, can you actually come up with a two-state solution? Or, any security arrangement for the West Bank is going to have to involve a very strong, close, collaborative relationship with Jordan. Now, the good news is the Jordanian security forces are really good. There's a very good, strong, long, trusting relationship between Israeli security forces and Jordanian security forces. But there is always this fear of what happens if ISIS takes over Jordan? What happens if the Hashemite kingdom collapses? And we've seen all these other assumptions. Really hard to imagine how you have a two-state solution without Jordan playing such a central role. And so that, I think, plays, when you add that to the feeling of the withdrawal from Gaza, withdrawal from southern Lebanon, and those were taken unilaterally and not through a negotiated agreement, but still what came afterwards, and the psyche the effect that's had on the Israeli psyche, and you put it all together, and it becomes a new daunting challenge. I will say that when negotiators in 2000, this actually applies writ large, I sort of say about the 2000 negotiations, they had the political setting to actually be able to get it done, but they didn't really have yet the depth of knowledge, of understanding of the details of the final status issues. By 2013, we'd had years of deep study of the actual issues themselves, and we as a team probably had a much better sense than they did in 2000. You can ask Dennis Ross, but we didn't have the political environment to actually make it work, and this is a big part of it. And in some ways, it could only get worse, especially on the security front for the Israeli public. And in 2000, the security issue was not seen as the paramount issue. It was Jerusalem, it was refugees. Now, in 2013 and 2014, we're doing it. Security was much bigger on the agenda than then.
Go ahead.
Here, I'm going to take a hopeful slice of your question. There is some good news. I mean, Rahm Emanuel, the mayor of Chicago, famously said that from every, don't let any good crisis go to waste. And what we've seen is that the Arab states, I'm not talking about the peoples, but the state system in the Gulf, you know, my colleague Ilan mentioned Egypt and Jordan, and Israel have drawn closer more than ever before. The term we used to talk about in government was strategic convergence, that there was a common enemy, which was Iran. And what the Ayatollah said, you know, death to America, death to Israel, he said some horrible things about these Sunni states. And I once joked with Defense Minister Yalon, who was a colleague of mine at the Washington Institute. I said, congratulations, Israel is the first Sunni state to be Jewish. Because below the radar, there's more convergences than ever. What upsets me is that the American Jewish community or the Israeli public, they don't see it because it's not public. So if it does it, they don't see it, it's as if it doesn't exist. But if you talk to the Israeli security people, they see it. It's below the radar. So I think in a strange way, in terms of the region, there are these convergences. Now, the question is, can you somehow capitalize on this convergence vis-a-vis Iran, dealing with Iranian proxies, stopping the cash injection that you know is going to happen to Hezbollah, maybe some of the Hamas, with Iran getting after this deal. I think you have more allies on that than you ever have. But whether they're able to really leverage that into an Israeli-Palestinian agreement, I personally, on this point, I am not so sure. I know there are people like Yair Lapid in Israel who says, think regionally, because you could get a peace agreement with all these countries. And I sat with him and I said, Yair, I think it's fantastic. My only question is, I'm going to bring you back to the 5 for 5. I know that sounds boring to people, but the 3 issues that bedeviled us, show me on these 3 issues how the regional environment is going to change. Secretary of State Kerry, to his credit, really tried to engage the Arab world. In Paris, I think he had 5 or 6 meetings to try to bring them in. But unfortunately, Abbas saw the Arab states as, your job is to give me political cover for something I want to do anyway. You're not supposed to be a pressure point on me to get me to do things I don't want to do. Let the Americans do that to the Israelis, but you don't do that to me. And that, I think, is the problem, is that on one hand, regionally, there's more convergences, there's more commonalities than ever. You don't see it because it's below the radar, but it's there. That's good. But I don't see the Arab states taking that one leap and saying, now we're going to use those commonalities to pressure Abbas to do something he doesn't want to do. That is a bridge too far for them. And that's what's so frustrating. You see the commonalities, but you don't see yet how that's going to take him over the finish line.
I think
Yes.
wasn't one intelligence official said that Israel is the concubine of the Middle East, that every ruler is willing to meet with her, but only in private behind, yeah.
Yeah, and it's partially, I mean,
I like those metaphors better than sports metaphors.
echoing David's point, I mean, the one challenge here, though, is you're never going to have that big breakthrough unless you have progress on the Israeli-Palestinian issues. They will never meet publicly. They will never take it to the next level. And so there's all this talk in Israel, and I agree with it, and is this quiet security cooperation, but it can't happen without the Israeli. It's ironic in that on the one hand, they care about, the Arab states care enough about the Israeli-Palestinian issue as a political issue to to not really engage with Israel more deeply in a public way unless you solve it. On the other hand, they don't care enough about the Israeli-Palestinian issue to actually push Abbas really hard. It's because they don't want to put any political chits into the game. And I don't think it's necessarily just Abbas telling them, I don't want to pressure you. They're saying, we don't want to put the political capital into pressuring Abbas. We don't care enough. Yeah. We had, during the negotiations, we were trying to get the Gulf states to give a few $100 extra million to Abbas to stabilize the situation in the West Bank. And it was like pulling teeth. At the same time, they gave $23 billion to Sisi over a year and a half at the same time. A few $100 million, $23 billion. Where do they put their strategic interest? They are not invested in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict right now. They are much more strategically invested in stabilizing Egypt, stabilizing Syria, Yemen, Iraq, all these other challenges. So, this, I generally am a little bit, I recognize the strategic convergence, but I have a hard time seeing how we convert it into something meaningful without a change here.
I think it's also harder today than it was a year ago when we were working on this, or a year and a half ago, with the decline and fragmentation of the Palestinian leadership. And I think something that we are probably focusing on more behind closed doors than out here in these forums is really transition post Abu Mazen He's been 79 for about 5 years now. I think he finally turned 80. But there is a real countdown mode and a lot of fear of, after the deluge once he's gone. And that's something that, this session's called Rock Bottom, but, this is the Middle East. They know their rocks. They know their bottoms. We have not hit that yet.
Well, with that, I think we can conclude. Thank you very much to the panelists, and thanks to the JFNA for having this session.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS, the Jewish Broadcasting Service, with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the JBS homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to Jem, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.